I found a locked door in my apartment that doesn't show up on the floor plan. I moved into my apartment in the middle of winter. The place seemed perfect. Cheap rent, good location, quiet neighbors. I wasn't expecting anything strange, but then I noticed something off the first night I stayed there. I'd already unpacked most of my things and was settling into bed when I heard it. The soft thud of something heavy hitting the wall. It came from the hallway outside my bedroom, just beyond the door. At first, I thought it was just the pipes, or maybe the building settling. But then it happened again, and again. A dull thud like something was gently knocking at my door. I opened it. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just the usual dim light from the overhead bulb. I shrugged it off, but the next few days felt wrong. Every time I walked through the apartment, I'd get this nagging feeling, like I was being watched. It was subtle, but it was there, like there was an invisible presence lurking just out of sight. Then came the door. It was a small door, tucked away at the very end of the hallway. I hadn't noticed it when I first moved in. The apartment's floor plan didn't show it, and there was nothing on the walls to indicate it was there. It was hidden in plain sight. And when I looked closer, I saw that it was locked. I couldn't stop staring at it. There was nothing unusual about the door, except for the fact that it wasn't on any floor plans I'd been given. It was a regular wooden door with a brass knob, a little worn, but in decent shape. But it shouldn't have been there. It didn't make sense. I tried to ask my landlord about it, but he looked at me like I was crazy when I mentioned it. "What door?" he asked. "There's no door there." But there it was, clear as day. I even pulled out the floor plan again. No door, just the wall where it should have been. I felt like I was losing my mind. But the more I thought about it, the more I had to know what was behind it. So one night, I made up my mind. I was going to open it. I couldn't explain why I felt so drawn to it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the sense of unease that had been creeping up on me since I'd moved in. But when I approached it, I felt something that made my skin crawl. A coldness, like the air around the door was different from the rest of the hallway. The lock was simple, just a rusted keyhole. I didn't have a key, but the lock looked old enough that I might be able to force it open. I pulled out a butter knife and started working at it. To my surprise, the lock gave way after only a few minutes of prying. My heart was racing as I turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell leading down into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, but then I stepped inside. The stairs were steep, and the air smelled damp. The whole space felt like it hadn't been touched in years. I descended, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. The deeper I went, the colder it got, until the temperature felt like I was standing in a freezer. At the bottom of the stairs was a door. This one was completely solid, no window, just an old iron handle. I reached for it, but the instant I touched the handle, the entire building seemed to shudder. The light flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness. I panicked and tried to run back up the stairs, but the door at the top, the one I had just opened, was gone. There was no door, just a blank wall. I screamed. My voice echoed in the dark, but there was no answer. I turned back to the iron door. I had to know what was behind it. I grasped the handle and turned it. The door opened into a small, dimly lit room. It was nothing special, just a bare concrete floor, some old boxes, and a single chair in the corner. But what caught my attention was the wall opposite me. It was covered in writing, scribbled in red, but too faded to read clearly. I stepped forward, leaning in to make out the words. But then, behind me, I heard something shift. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness closing in, the sound of my own breath, and the unmistakable feeling that something had been waiting for me. I haven't touched the door since. I haven't even looked at it. The hallway still feels colder when I walk past, and every night, just as I'm about to fall asleep, I hear it. A faint scratching sound, like nails running down the wall. And when I open my eyes, I'm sure I see something moving in the shadows at the end of the hall. It's waiting. And so am I. The noise in the walls. The noise in the walls. I had always thought of my apartment as a quiet, peaceful place. Nestled on the edge of a busy city, it was an oasis of calm amidst the chaos outside. But that sense of peace shattered one night when I began to hear the noises coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of an old building settling. The pipes groaned, the radiator hissed, and the creaking of wooden floors was an almost comforting reminder that the building was alive. But the noises that started coming from the walls weren't like that. They were different, unnatural. It started one evening as I was lying in bed, trying to drift off to sleep. I had just turned off the lights when I heard a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across the surface of the wall behind me. It was barely audible, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I dismissed it as the wind or an animal outside, but the scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. The sound came from the space between the walls, somewhere deeper in the apartment structure. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but it didn't stop. In fact, it grew worse. The scratching turned to tapping, a rhythmic, deliberate tapping, as if someone or something was knocking from inside the wall. I turned on the lights, heart racing, and stood still, listening. I could hear it now, clearer than before. A faint but distinct tap, tap, echoing through the wall. I walked to the kitchen, my pulse quickening with every step. My mind raced with possibilities. Rodents, plumbing issues, anything that could explain this strange sound. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. There was something about it that felt wrong. This wasn't a natural noise. For the next few nights, the tapping continued, dead, growing more frequent and louder, as if whatever was in the walls was getting closer. It was driving me mad. I tried calling my landlord, but he assured me it was probably nothing to worry about, just the old pipes in the building. I wasn't convinced. One night, after a particularly loud tapping session, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, determined to find the source of the noise. I had to know what was happening behind the walls of my apartment. I stood in the center of the room, listening carefully. The noise was coming from the far wall, right behind my bed. Without thinking, I grabbed a small chair and dragged it over to the wall, standing on it so I could reach the top. My flashlight flickered in the dark, casting eerie shadows across the room. I tapped the wall with my knuckles, hoping to hear a response. I wanted to get it over with, to stop the tapping, but all I heard was silence. For a moment, I thought it was all in my head. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then something tapped back. It wasn't just a faint knock. It was a forceful, almost angry tap, like something or someone was on the other side, answering me. My heart skipped a beat. I could feel the blood rush to my ears, and the noise seemed to rattle through my entire body. I froze, not sure what to do. Should I call the police? Should I break open the wall? But before I could act, a soft voice, a whisper, came from behind the wall. "Let me out." I recoiled, my throat tightening with fear. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there, alive, coming from somewhere within the walls. I stumbled back, almost falling off the chair. My hand shot out to turn on the light, but before I could, the tapping started again. Only this time it was faster, more frantic. It felt like something was trying to break through, scratching and clawing its way out. The sound grew louder and more desperate with each passing second. The whispering continued, barely perceptible, but I could hear it clearly now. "Please, let me out." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to flee, I heard the voice again, louder this time, more distinct. "You let me in, now you have to let me out." I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. My body felt cold, paralyzed by the terror that was crawling under my skin. I felt the weight of the presence behind the wall, the sense of something, or someone, waiting just beyond reach, tapping and scratching, whispering for release. I don't know how I got out of the apartment that night, but when I did, I immediately called a locksmith to inspect the wall. He couldn't find anything. No pipes, no wires, no explanation, just solid wood and drywall. The noise stopped that night, but the feeling of something watching me from behind the walls never left. I still live in the apartment, but the tapping hasn't returned, at least, not yet. But every time I lay down to sleep, I hear the faintest echo, as if the walls are waiting for me to listen again. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I hear the whispering, just barely audible, "Let me out." The thing in the attic. It had been years since I last stepped into the attic. The house was old, built in the late 1800s, and the attic was one of those places that my parents always warned me to stay away from. When I was younger, I never questioned it, but as an adult, I couldn't help but feel an odd sense of curiosity, especially after I inherited the house from my late aunt, who had lived here alone for as long as I could remember. There had always been strange things about this house. Odd creaks in the floorboards when no one was walking, windows that opened and closed on their own, lights flickering at odd times. But it was the attic that always intrigued me. There was a heavy, foreboding feeling whenever I looked up at the staircase leading to it. The door had always been locked, and I never once found the key. When I finally settled into the house, I spent days sorting through boxes and papers. But the attic door remained sealed, as if something inside was waiting for the right moment to make itself known. That's when I found the key. It was tucked away in a small drawer in the living room, buried beneath a pile of old receipts. I didn't know why it hadn't caught my attention before. It wasn't much to look at, just an old brass key with a faint rusted tint. But it felt important. That evening, I decided to open the attic door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, the air thick with dust and something else. Something cold, almost suffocating. The light bulb overhead flickered as I approached the top, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. I pushed the door open and the smell hit me immediately. It was a damp, earthy smell, like something had been rotting up there for years. My heart pounded in my chest, but I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, illuminating the cluttered space. There were old boxes, furniture covered in faded sheets, and stacks of forgotten heirlooms. But what caught my attention wasn't the clutter. It was the movement. Something was in the corner, obscured in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just an old coat rack or a pile of discarded furniture. But as I moved closer, I realized the shape wasn't quite right. It was too long, too contorted. The flashlight's beam flickered as I took another step forward, and that's when I saw it. The figure. It was crouched low, almost unnaturally so, its limbs twisted in a way that made it look more like a rag doll than a person. Its head was lowered, but I could see the faint outline of its face, pale, gaunt, and covered in deep grooves, as though the skin had been stretched too tightly. Its eyes were wide open, but they were black, empty holes that seemed to absorb the light around them. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The figure slowly raised its head, tilting it at an unnatural angle, and I heard a faint whisper, like a hiss, come from its mouth. "Leave." The voice was deep, almost guttural, like it came from somewhere far beneath the earth. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. The figure stood up, its limbs creaking as if they hadn't been used in years. It was tall, too tall. Its body swayed as it took a step toward me, and I could feel its gaze piercing through me, even though its eyes were nothing but empty pits. "You should never have opened the door," it whispered again, the words slipping out like a cold breeze. I stumbled backward, bumping into an old cabinet that rattled against the wall. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring every moment of my terror. My pulse was racing, my breathing shallow. I was trapped. In a panic, I turned to flee, but as I did, something heavy fell from the rafters above. A loud, hollow thud echoed throughout the attic, and I whipped around to see another figure. This one larger, with long, bony arms that dragged along the floor as it slowly approached. Its mouth was wide open, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that glistened in the dim light. I didn't think. I ran. The stairs were a blur as I bolted down them, hearing the soft scrape of something following me, just barely out of reach. I could feel the cold breath on my neck, the faint whisper growing louder, as if it was calling my name, beckoning me back to the attic. I slammed the attic door shut behind me, breathing heavily, my mind racing. I leaned against the door, trying to steady myself, but the unease in my gut told me it wasn't over. The attic door was locked again. I checked, but when I turned around, I saw something that froze me in place. A single black handprint had been pressed into the door. It was smeared across the wood, as if it had been left there by something that had been watching me the entire time. I never went back up to the attic after that night. The door is still locked, but I can feel it. Whatever is up there is still waiting. And I know, deep down, it's just a matter of time before it comes for me again. The unseen guest. It was a quiet, typical evening when I first noticed the odd occurrence in my apartment. I had just returned home from work, tired and ready to unwind. The apartment was dark, save for the soft light of my desk lamp. I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the couch, eager for some peace. But then I heard it, a soft click. At first, I assumed it was just the old floorboards creaking, a sound I had grown used to in the building. But it came again. Click. This time, it sounded like a door opening. I froze. The apartment was empty, or at least I thought it was. My roommate, Emma, had left for the weekend, and I was alone. But that click sounded like it came from her room. I hesitated, wondering if I had simply misheard it. I stood up and walked cautiously toward her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I felt an inexplicable chill in the air. When I pushed the door open, the room was empty. No one was there. The bed was undisturbed, the window shut tight. Confused, I turned to leave, but then I noticed something odd. The closet door was cracked open, just a sliver, but enough for me to see a faint shadow inside. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The shadow seemed to shift, as though something was standing just out of view. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine as I reached out and swung the door wide open. The closet was empty. Nothing. No shadow, no movement. I turned away, trying to shake the feeling of unease. But when I went back to the living room, I heard it again. Another click, followed by soft footsteps. I ran back to the hall. Nothing. The silence was deafening, but my pulse raced. I wasn't imagining it. The noise was real. At that moment, the feeling of being watched hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. I kept the light on in the living room, hoping that would keep whatever it was at bay. But as the hours passed, I kept hearing soft footsteps coming closer and closer. The next day, I asked Emma about it, and she returned. She looked at me, confused. "You didn't hear anything last night? You were here alone," she said. But that wasn't true. Someone or something had been there with me, and whatever it wasn't planning to leave.